All right, let's dive right into this explainer. We're going to reconstruct one of the most pivotal events of the 20th century. And we're not going to look at it as some inevitable tragedy, but as a deeply contested, high stakes ideological collision. Because, history is never written in advance. It's forged by individuals, deep rooted beliefs, and split second decisions that literally alter the course of civilizations. Today, we're going to completely immerse ourselves in the volatile, newly independent India of 1948. I want you to picture a landscape thick with the scent of ash from communal riots, a total political vacuum left by the British, and millions of displaced, traumatized refugees pouring across new borders. We are stepping into this bleeding, unwritten world to unravel exactly how and why a world-altering assassination took place. Consider these words for a second. Just 2 days before his death, an increasingly frail Mahatma Gandhi uttered this chilling prophecy. He wasn't blind to the dangers surrounding him. The subcontinent was violently divided, and Gandhi, fiercely advocating for nonviolence and unity, was right in the crosshairs of extreme political factions. He knew for a fact his life was under imminent threat, yet he continually refused tighter security cordons. Now, this wasn't passive acceptance. It was a massive, high-stakes political and spiritual gamble. He was actively transforming his own iron-willed vulnerability into a final, profound statement, one that absolutely terrified his inner circle. To truly grasp the climax of this story, we actually have to start our narrative 10 days before the fatal shots. Picture the tense, twilight scene at Birla House in New Delhi. A multi-faith prayer meeting is suddenly shattered by a massive concussive blast. A refugee named Madanlal Pawa detonates a gun-cotton bomb. The acrid smell of smoke fills the air, panic rips through the crowd. But here's the thing. This was meant to be the distraction for a synchronized crossfire that, failed to materialize. The explosion wasn't a warning. It was a botched opening salvo. Pawa was tackled and captured in the chaos, but the terrifying reality immediately set in for the authorities. This was a highly organized hit. So while Pawa is sitting in police custody, a highly sophisticated shadow cell is scrambling to adapt. Led logistically by Narayan Apte and ideologically by Nathuram Godse, the remaining operatives literally melted into the shadows of this fractured post-partition landscape. Realizing explosives were way too unpredictable, they executed a terrifyingly swift pivot. Navigating the black market, Godse and Apte secured a 9mm Beretta semi-automatic pistol in Gwalior and immediately raced back to Delhi. The failure of their first attempt didn't deter them in the slightest. If anything, it only accelerated their timeline toward a direct, point-blank strike. Fast forward to the evening of January 30th. The winter light is fading. Gandhi, 78 years old and severely weakened from a recent fast, leans heavily on his grandnieces as he walks toward the prayer lawn. The crowd presses in. Suddenly, a stout young man in a khaki jacket pushes his way through the mass of followers. It's Nathuram Godse. He bows, pretending to touch Gandhi's feet in traditional reverence. But in a brutal, split-second juxtaposition, he draws the Beretta and fires 3 shots directly into the Mahatma's chest and abdomen. Gandhi utters, "Hey Ram, oh God," and collapses onto the grass. Within minutes, the architect of Indian independence is dead. The gunshots faded, but you have to understand this was absolutely not the impulsive act of a solitary madman. It was a pressure valve exploding. To comprehend the sheer gravity of this moment, we have to zoom out from the manicured lawns of Birla House to the existential dread of a newborn nation. This assassination was the endpoint of a highly organized, relentless campaign by extremists. They viewed Gandhi's political and moral influence not as some unifying force, but as a direct, mortal threat to their vision of the country. Because that final pull of the trigger, it was actually the culmination of a 14-year shadow war. We're talking bombs hurled at cars in 1934, dagger attacks and armed mobs intercepted in 1944, a deliberate train derailment in 1946. These hardline factions had been trying to neutralize Gandhi for over a decade. And the maddening psychological reality for the assassins was that every time they failed, Gandhi simply refused to press charges. He essentially weaponized their physical violence against them, wielding this moral shield that steel and explosives just continually failed to dent. But we have to ask why. Why did they want him dead with such desperate ferocity? Well, in August 1947, a line was drawn on a map by the departing British Empire, severing millennia of shared history. The subcontinent was partitioned into India and Pakistan. This triggered the total overnight collapse of an economic and social ecosystem. Up to 17 million people were uprooted. Refugee trains arrived in Delhi soaked in blood, leaving over 1 million dead in horrific communal slaughter. This absolute visceral trauma birthed a deadly ideological clash between Gandhi's vision of a secular, inclusive society and a radicalism born straight from the ashes of partition. When we break down this ideological collision, the immediate flashpoint was actually economic. And the paradox here is staggering. India owed Pakistan 55 crore rupees, a massive sum, as part of the partition agreement. But the two nations were already at war over Kashmir, so the Indian government froze the funds. In response, Gandhi undertook a fast unto death. He leveraged his own frail life to force his nation to honor the financial agreement, believing this absolute moral truth would foster peace. But to a traumatized refugee or a nationalist like Godse, this was totally incomprehensible. They viewed it as outright treason, literally starving your own people to finance an enemy army currently shooting at Indian soldiers. You see, the conspirators were operating within a highly structured, rigid nationalist ecosystem, groups like the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS, which collided violently with Gandhi's fluid, secular ideals. Godse didn't act out of blind personal hatred. In his own mind, his internal calculus was one of cold, wartime triage. He firmly believed he was executing a vital, calculated intervention to halt the ruin of a divided nation and prevent further appeasement that he was certain would lead to the destruction of the Hindu majority. So what happens next? The legal and political fallout is blindingly swift. The dramatic narrative moves behind the towering, ancient Mughal walls of Delhi's Red Fort. A special court was convened here under Judge Atmasharan. And this wasn't just for security. It was deliberate legal theater. The state was teetering on the edge of anarchy, and it desperately needed to project order, control, and stability to a traumatized public that was ready to tear the accused apart. Inside that courtroom, Nathuram Godse actually refused legal counsel. Instead, he stood alone and delivered a 150-page, 5-hour defense with this chilling, terrifying calm. He didn't ask for mercy, and he certainly didn't deny the murder. Instead, he attempted to put Gandhi's philosophy of absolute nonviolence on trial. He impartially laid out his political motives, arguing to the judge that his actions were a grim but necessary duty to save the nation from a man whose disproportionate political influence was destroying the country. He fully anticipated the gallows and embraced it as a political sacrifice. But the newly formed Indian government, specifically Home Minister Sardar Patel, knew exactly what they were dealing with. They realized this wasn't just about one man pulling a trigger. This was an existential battle for the new republic's lifeblood. Patel explicitly linked the assassination to the extremist rhetoric of the Hindu Mahasabha and the RSS. The state was fighting for its monopoly on violence. By pointing to the communal poison these groups fostered, Patel wasn't just seeking justice for murder. He was surgically excising a competing militant ideology by banning the RSS and arresting tens of thousands of its members. Ultimately, the verdicts were definitive: death by hanging for Godse and his logistical mastermind Narayan Apte, while others received life sentences. Savarkar was controversially acquitted due to lack of evidence. But then, a profound, almost tragic historical paradox unfolds. Gandhi's own sons, Manilal and Ramdas, filed a formal mercy petition. They pleaded that executing their father's assassins fundamentally betrayed the Mahatma's lifelong commitment to nonviolence. Yet Prime Minister Nehru and Patel, men who had spent their entire lives as Gandhi's disciples, had to act as statesmen. To maintain law, order, and the sheer survival of the state birthed by nonviolence, they had to pull the lever on the gallows. The immediate aftermath of the shooting plunged this fragile new state into an emotional shockwave that's honestly hard to quantify. India had lost its founding father before the ink was even dry on its independence. That evening, Prime Minister Nehru addressed the nation in an agonizing, extemporaneous radio broadcast. His voice trembling over the airwaves, he uttered the immortal words, "The light has gone out of our lives and there is darkness everywhere." It was a desperate plea to anchor a terrified, orphaned populace. The sheer scale of this grief materialized the very next day. Think about this number for a second. 1 million. 1 million people formed a vast, crushing sea of white mourning garments flooding the streets of New Delhi. For a 5-mile funeral procession leading to Rajghat, there was this overwhelming, tangible silence. It was the visual weight of collective trauma pouring through the capital, an absolutely unparalleled image of a fractured nation trying to process an impossible, catastrophic loss. But the state knew that a single cremation in Delhi wasn't going to heal the rupture. They were facing the monumental task of unifying a deeply traumatized country. And so, they orchestrated this masterpiece of sociological engineering. They created the Asti Special, a train that carried a portion of Gandhi's ashes on a long, circuitous route to the sacred rivers at Allahabad. This wasn't just transport, it was a decentralized, moving ritual. By having millions stand by the tracks and participate in shared grief, the government bound the wounds of partition and began forging a unified national identity right out of the ashes. Instantly, the reverberations echoed far beyond India's borders. Global leaders, former adversaries, and brilliant scientific minds reacted in stunned silence. But something incredible happened in the wake of the tragedy. In death, Gandhi ceased to be merely a mortal, anti-colonial politician. He was instantly elevated into an immortal, strategic concept. His assassination served to permanently weaponize the philosophy of nonviolence, laying the foundational blueprint for civil rights leaders like Martin Luther King Jr. and Nelson Mandela for decades to come. Fascinatingly, the psychological need to hold on to the Mahatma was so intense that it actually altered ancient traditions. According to Hindu custom, ashes are swiftly scattered in rivers or the sea. Yet devoted followers secretly secreted portions of his remains away in bank vaults and hidden shrines, totally unable to let him go. Remarkable, delayed ceremonies took place well into the modern era. His ashes were scattered in the Ganges in 1997, off the coast of Mumbai in 2008, and in South Africa in 2010, constantly reaffirming his family's insistence that he belonged to the elements, not to museum displays. We've seen how the violent climax of 1948 was born from a fierce, terrifying ideological collision over the very soul of a new republic. Nathuram Godse pulled the trigger with the absolute conviction that his bullets would erase Gandhi's influence and save his own vision of India. But as we know, history is built on monumental paradoxes. So as we wrap up this explainer, we're left with a question we all have to ask ourselves. Did the assassin's bullets destroy the Mahatma's vision, or did the sheer shock of his murder permanently immortalize his message of peace for the entire world?